Again. So I'm here to talk to you today about the British Army in Jane Austen's time. And I'll start by saying that my title is a lie. Because the first thing that we need to understand is that there was not one British Army. I'll come to that in a moment. Firstly, however, I wanted to give a little bit of context. What was going on in Jane Austen's lifetime. So the first thing to remember is that Britain was more or less continuously at war with France throughout this entire period from 1789 to 1815, with the exception of the Peace of Amiens, which lasted less than a year. They were continuously at war with France. They were also, from the time of Napoleon Bonaparte becoming first consul, up until Trafalgar, the prospect of an actual invasion of Britain by Imperial France was very real. They were under as much threat of invasion at the very beginning of the 19th century as they were in 1940. If that weren't enough, they were also engaged in conflicts in India, North America, Africa, and the Pacific. So it is therefore perhaps a little surprising that all this conflict is remarkably absent from Jane Austen's novels. Though I do promise that towards the end of my talk, I will talk about why it's not surprising that essentially ignoring the war does not make her odd. It makes her entirely typical of people in her class of society. So, to lay some groundwork for why Britain and those in the gentry class were less engaged with the war, I thought I would start with this famous quote from Napoleon Bonaparte, which is one of those quotes that most people have heard of, or at least I naively imagine most people have heard of, but probably don't understand the context for. So essentially, the first thing we need to understand that is, unlike later in the 19th century, when we come to the Victorian period, where with the rise of empire, the army becomes a great deal more respectable, the gentry class, overwhelmingly in England at least, had from the 17th century through to the early 19th century regarded the whole idea of standing armies with a great deal of suspicion. They felt that these were not something that Britain should have. And they would, mostly because they didn't want to pay for them. Because, of course, one of the things that it is worth bearing in mind, and something that you can all curse Napoleon Bonaparte for to this day, is income tax. Britain did not have income tax until the Napoleonic Wars, where they were instituted as an emergency measure. We all know how that went. However, amongst the gentry class throughout this period, there was a general feeling that having a standing army was a threat to their position, either because it could become the instrument of royal oppression, the whole Jacobite Stuart history, or that it could be, again, the instrument of Cromwellian dictatorship. And this is one of the reasons that even at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had far and away the smallest army of any combatant country by a huge margin. The British army was, I think, less than a tenth of the size of the French. I'll talk about some of the reasons for that a little later. So instead, the British preferred to pay other opponents of the French to fight land wars rather than fight them themselves. So they spent most of the period funding, most notably Prussia, Austria, and Russia. This could be very frustrating for them because at many times each of those kingdoms at different times made peace with Bonaparte. So sometimes they would pay them to fight Bonaparte, and then they would have to bribe them to break their peace treaties. They also supplied a lot of their material. So I've given you there, that's an illustration of a Prussian hussar. And now I'm going to be very nerdy in my sword knowledge. So Prussian hussars actually carried the British 1796 pattern light cavalry sabre. And the Prussians liked it so much that they, after the Napoleonic Wars, they made their own version of it, and indeed German officers continued to carry a version of the British 1796 pattern light cavalry sabre right up to the First World War. So, I mentioned earlier that Britain didn't have one army. In fact, it had three. Well, all right, really four, but the other one wasn't really British. So anyone who listened to the podcast I did with Harriet, where I said there were three armies, I'm now adding another one, because I remembered that, of course, the British royal family are German. So there are three, and I will talk about each of them in more detail as I go along. The largest of them was not an army controlled by the British government at all. It was controlled by the East India Company. So if you think that Microsoft and Google have too much power now, remember that at the end of the 18th and into the middle of the 19th century, a multinational corporation ruled the second largest, most populous, wealthiest country on earth. Then we have the militia, as featured in Pride and Prejudice. And I will warn you now that you're going to think a lot less of the militia after my talk than you may already. And then we have the regular army, which was the smallest of the three, for reasons that I'll talk about. And in fact, how the militia was one of the major impediments to the British regular army. However, I did, of course, remember as I was preparing this that there was another aspect of British forces, and that was the King's German Legion. So George III, as well as being quite absurd, thank you, Horrible Histories, was nominally at least still the Elector of Hanover. This is nominally at least because Napoleon had conquered Hanover. So he also had German troops. Those troops were originally raised from his lands in Germany, in Hanover. However, they continued after the conquest, and essentially they recruited any German-speaking volunteers they could find to fill up those units. They were incredibly well respected. Wellington, for example, particularly admired the King's German Legion cavalry. That's all I'm going to say about them because they don't appear in Jane Austen. Okay. So as I mentioned, the East India Company had the largest army controlled by Britons, if not by the British government. It was significantly larger than the British regular army. The troops themselves were overwhelmingly Indian. The officers were largely British, and notice I said British rather than English, as Scots and Irish were very overrepresented in the officer class of the East India Company. There were some that were Anglo-Indian, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later when I talk about the British Army in India, which is something different. So perhaps the most famous member of the East India Company, Colonel Skinner, whose regiment still exists today, Skinner's Horse. They were part of the East India Company, the army, then they were part of the British Army in India, then they were and still are amongst the most prestigious of Indian Army regiments, had an English father and an Indian mother. They were the least prestigious of the various branches of the military, but they did offer the greatest possibility for wealth. There was the possibility of becoming a nabob. Now, some of you are thinking, hang on, Michael. Colonel Brandon was in India. He was in the Indies. Surely he was a member of the East India Company army. Well, no, he wasn't. I can confidently tell you that he absolutely was not. He was a member of a British regiment serving in India or the Indies. I'll talk about that in a great deal more detail later. So, let's talk about the militia. So they were a home defence force. They were, in some ways, a precursor for the National Guard or the Army Reserve here in Australia, though neither of those august institutions would thank you for the comparison. They were raised only in England and Wales. They even 50 years or more after the last Jacobite rebellion, there were no militia raised in Scotland. They still did not fancy giving the jocks muskets. So they were part-time soldiers. And they were only for home defence. Militia units were specifically barred from foreign service. Though two militia regiments battalions did volunteer to go and serve in Ireland, demonstrating that the combination of religious bigotry and the personal interests of officers who probably owned land there as well overcame that legal impediment. So, if you had, in reading Pride and Prejudice, had imagined that the militia officers there were gallant young men about to face death in the cannon's mouth, fighting Napoleon, no, they weren't. They were doing a George W. Bush. They were joining the military to get out of going to war. Okay, so the militia were raised at the county level. They were instituted actually to replace something that had previously existed, which was even more incompetent. So if you've heard of the fencibles or the volunteers, so a whole lot of landowners, when the French Revolution broke out, more or less spontaneously raised their own home guard type units. And they were frankly becoming a complete menace. There was no control over them. There was no central authority. So the government imposed, officially abolished them and established the militia. Now, and the militia were separate from the regular army in a variety of interesting and surprising ways. So the officers of the militia they were raised at and organised at the county level, though it should be said that it would be a mistake to assume that the Somersetshire militia, the majority of the troops would be from Somerset. I'll talk about that in a moment. However, all the officers would be members of the gentry class from that area. So Colonel Forster was not a grizzled military veteran, but he was a local landowner who was probably wealthier than some of the others. He may well have got the contract to supply uniforms or something like that. So there is no reason that you should assume that Colonel Forster was in any meaningful way a military man, nor any of the others. And so the officers were recruited from the local gentry class, and there was no training required. There were no qualifications needed to be a militia officer, which is not altogether surprising because, as I'll talk about later, there weren't any for being a regular army officer either. Actually, there is one. You're not allowed to be a Roman Catholic. So yes, they weren't very keen. Given where we are, I should also point out they weren't very keen on Methodists either. Though Methodists were mostly seen as a problem in Methodism amongst the common soldiers was seen as a major problem because Methodists did all kinds of inconvenient things like teaching them to read and suggesting that they had rights and all kinds of inconvenient things. Okay, so they were raised from amongst the local gentry. So that, of course, does raise the interesting question of how Wickham gained his commission. So either he simply charmed Colonel Forster, or perhaps he won at gambling. But it was very much a crony system. There wasn't purchase for the militia. That's something that I'll talk about a little later. However, there is the larger question, since officers were paid, but the lifestyle required, particularly of the militia, meant that one needed a private income beyond that in order to maintain the lifestyle, which looked rather a lot like the right-hand painting over there, by the way. So it does beg the question, who was paying for his uniforms, his mess bills and his other expenses? So yes, officers had to provide their own uniforms, equipment, horses. They had to pay their own mess bills. So I suspect that those are amongst the debts that have to be paid by Darcy later in the novel. So let me talk a little bit more about the structure of the militia. So unlike the regular army, there was conscription into the militia. They were chosen by ballot from amongst able-bodied men of the parish between the ages of 18 and 50, and would serve for 3 years, though that was then later extended to 5. Though it should be said that that was not 12 months of the year. They were usually in the field for around 3 months of the year. However, if you didn't want to serve, there were 2 get out of jail not free cards. You could pay a £10 fine, or you could provide a substitute. So, and there was a ready market for substitutes. And as I'll talk about, and this became a massive problem for the regular army, because militia soldiers actually got paid more than soldiers in the regular army. They didn't have to go overseas, and it must be pointed, as I'll talk about, casualties in the regular army were overwhelmingly from disease rather than from combat. So it was a massive problem that the militia, through the substitute system, was drawing off many of the best qualified potential recruits for the regular army. And this wasn't helped by the fact that their military competence might be reasonably described as being questionable. Okay. So, as I said, they were raised as a home defense force in the event of the French invasion. Of course, after 1803, after Trafalgar and the destruction of the French and Spanish fleets, there was no longer any realistic possibility of such an invasion, and really the military need for the militia was at best questionable at this time. And over the next decade or more, there were many moves to have them abolished. Wellington, for example, was thoroughly despised the militia. Regular army officers in general tended to have a very low opinion of them. So they were a force that was costing the government a lot of money, that had no real military benefits. Why weren't they abolished? Well, probably because most of their colonels would also have been the local MP. So they were not abolished, and a few things happened in terms of trying to ameliorate this problem. With the threat of invasion being ameliorated, the regular army would increasingly move even its home battalion onto foreign service, and their place would be taken in garrison duties by the militia, as in Pride and Prejudice, where they go, and I'm mental blanking, Harriet would, when they go to Brighton. There we have an example of, they would have gone to, so Brighton, which was a major military centre, a major naval centre. The British always recognised that their navy was far more important than their army perhaps I'll come back and talk about the Navy next time the button lady cancels. So they increasingly took on some of those roles. They also, Wellington and his Tories finally managed to ram through Parliament a bill which allowed men from the militia to volunteer to go and join the regular army, which surprisingly a number of them did. One of the sticking points for Wellington was having to allow militia officers to go too. Okay. So, that is the militia. So let's talk about the British regular army. So as I've already mentioned, theirs was the smallest army of any of the major powers. And so I think the first myth that I need to dispel is the idea that the army was posh, that army officers were posh. That's a preconception that mostly comes via Hollywood, and if it's based in fact at all, it's based on the British Army of the second half of the 19th century, under the Raj in the full flower of empire, when it had become much more powerful and it also had become, frankly, much more safe. You can always tell when a posting becomes safe because suddenly the gentry and the aristocracy are willing to be posted there. So, some context to the statement in Sense and Sensibility that Edward thought that the army was far too grand for him. There are only a very small number of regiments that were regarded as prestigious at the moment and at that time. And no character in any Jane Austen novel is a member of them. So they are essentially the Guards regiments, where officers tended to be younger sons of the peerage, usually third or fourth sons, neither the heir nor the spare, and then often the third would get shoved off into the church. If you had any more after that, then you'd put them in the Guards. But overwhelmingly, aside from those Guards regiments and cavalry regiments, cavalry regiments were also very fashionable. Beau Brummel was briefly a subaltern in a cavalry regiment before his incompetence became so embarrassing, even by British Army standards, they had to get rid of him. This was when, on a royal parade, he came onto parade in front of the wrong squadron. So, no military character in Jane Austen will have been a member of a cavalry regiment. None of them are prestigious enough. I won't go into my usual rant about Hollywood and television productions apparently not understanding the difference between the aristocracy and the gentry, and Mr. Darcy invariably being given a stately home that actually belonged to a duke. But none of them would be prestigious enough for those regiments. However, there was a massive cultural, social gulf between them and the bulk of the army, the line infantry regiments. They were not seen as a prestigious or a desirable career amongst the gentry, not least because the opportunity for wealth was so much less than in the Navy. If you've ever wondered why Captain Wentworth in Persuasion talks about, "Lord, how I made money in that ship," that was because the Royal Navy throughout this period, if you were a naval officer, it was essentially licensed piracy. Any ship from an enemy power you took was sold off. The admiral got a big chunk, the captain got a bigger chunk, and everyone else got money out of it. At least in theory, in the army, looting was banned. I say in theory. They tended to be fairly scrupulous about that in Europe, much less so in India and the Indies. But it was seen as a less desirable financial position, and there was a relatively high chance of death. Not on the battlefield. Overwhelmingly, the risk was due to disease, particularly on overseas postings. So, line infantry officers, your average red coat, who made up the overwhelming majority, tended to be the younger sons of the lesser gentry, exactly like Colonel Brandon in Sense and Sensibility. And there was no formal training. The first formal training for officers in a British context was later in the 19th century, and that was for the East India Company officers. East India Company officers got training 30 or 40 years before British Army officers did. I should talk about another famous quote. So many people are aware that Wellington described his own troops as the scum of the earth. Let me give you a bit of context for that. This comment came in the context of him comparing the British Army with the French. So he says, the French system of conscription brings together a fair sample of all classes. Ours is composed of the scum of the earth. The mere scum of the earth, it is only wonderful that we should be able to make so much out of them afterwards. So this is another reason why the British Army is so much smaller than the French. So it must be said that the French, under Napoleon, raised larger armies than had been seen since the fall of Rome through conscription. And Napoleon then became very gifted at developing tactics that worked well with these large bodies of citizen soldiers. Harriet made me promise not to talk too much about tactics, but essentially the French would attack like a battering ram. They would form up their infantry into a column, and then they would advance towards the enemy, breaking their line. So Napoleon on land was a bit like Nelson at sea. He believed very much in the flying column, but it was mostly about the sheer psychological impact of having massive numbers of troops all advancing together rapidly in column, shouting "Vive l'Empereur!" So Napoleon won most of his battles because the enemy troops broke before the column even reached them. The exception were the scum of the earth. So the British infantry despite having a well-deserved reputation as being recruited from the lowest of the low. And this is absolutely true. Many magistrates gave people the option of prison, transportation, or the army. Many of the others were overwhelmingly from amongst the rural poor. Many of them were Scots, and despite the prohibition against Roman Catholics as officers, rather more than 40% of the English army was actually made up of poor Irishmen. However, they were regarded as the finest infantry in the world. And there's one reason for that which may surprise you. While the British Army did not believe in training its officers, it did believe in training its men. And they also sensibly had them trained by the sergeants, not by the officers. And the British Army was the only army in Europe at the time that actually allowed its men to train with live ammunition. I'll let that sink in for a moment. Most of Europe's armies, the first time you got to fire an actual shot was on the battlefield. Having fired one, I can tell you that a musket does kick very surprisingly hard, and there is a delay between the flash in the pan, igniting the priming, and the weapon going off. And they're smoothbore. They have no rifling in them. They're very inaccurate. During the Napoleonic period, the aim is not to aim at an individual soldier. It is to engage in volley fire. So you fire as an entire rank towards the line of the opponents, not seeking to hit an individual, but aiming at the entire mass. So the British were famous for their ability to fire 3 shots in a minute. Doesn't sound very much, but remember, you have to ram down the powder, then ram down the ball, prime the pan, raise it and fire. And they fought in line. They fought in only 3 ranks, sometimes only in 2, versus the French mass columns. So that's why they stood out. The other question that I often think about is, why did they fight? Why did they fight so ferociously on the battlefields of the peninsula and at Waterloo? I think it's safe to say they did not fight for king and country. I think they fought for their mates, they fought for their battalion, they fought for each other. And if you look at the culture of the British Army in this period, it is all about the regiment and about the battalion. So you may be aware that the preservation of the regimental colours is all important, and the greatest glory one could gain as a soldier at the time was the capture of an enemy standard, which is where the term ensign comes from. Ensigns originally, so they are the most junior officers in an infantry regiment. I was supposed to talk about this with the militia, Harriet is going to point out. And they could be very young. They could be as young as 15. I'll go back to the militia slide. So they can be very young. So you may remember Chamberlain, the cross-dresser, dressed up by Kitty and Lydia in Pride and Prejudice. He was quite possibly a militia ensign, and he could have been as young as 14 or 15. So their job the name comes from one of the roles of the ensign was to carry the colours into battle. As a consequence, they always positioned two of the senior sergeants either side of them to protect them. Okay, now most officers would spend their entire career in the same regiment, in fact, usually in the same battalion of the same regiment. Troopers invariably spent their entire career in the same battalion of the same regiment. So their whole culture, their whole identity is around the regiment. And so they are fighting for their regiment. They are fighting for the man either side of them. And they are fighting out of professional pride. And so I should, of course, mention another quote by the Duke of Wellington, this made about the Devil's Own. Any Irish here? Who are the famous Irish regiment? Wellington said, I don't know whether they frighten the enemy, but by God, they frighten me. Lest you think that Wellington, as a younger son of a junior Irish peer, that would suggest that he had any fondness for the Irish. I will give you another quote which he made later in life when, as Prime Minister, a visiting American diplomat described him as an Irishman. He said, being born in a stable does not make one a horse. However, Wellington himself is an excellent lead-in to the whole issue of purchase. This is the deeply peculiar one would think self-evidently flawed system by which one became an officer and one could gain promotion within the British regular army. So essentially, one paid for a commission. So in Pride and Prejudice, when Darcy buys Wickham an ensigncy, that's what's happening. If you wanted to become an officer, you had to have the means to pay for it. But it was also possible to buy promotion. Now, there were limitations on this, and this is something else that Hollywood and others invariably get wrong to my extreme irritation. Okay, so it was essentially an officially sanctioned system by which one could pay for a commission in an infantry or cavalry regiment, not the artillery. I won't talk about them because they're not in Jane Austen. You could also pay to rise from one rank to another, but you had to go through each of the ranks. Now, you could only purchase from another officer. So an officer who was retiring or who was himself buying to another rank could sell his commission. Deaths, battlefield casualties, death by disease, those vacancies were filled by seniority within the battalion. The widows did not get to keep the commission and sell them. So the overwhelming majority of officers, certainly of infantry officers, would have never purchased a promotion. They'd have purchased their original ensigncy and then done all the rest via seniority within their battalion. But it did mean that if you had the wealth or the influence, then you could purchase your way up the system very quickly, which brings me back to Arthur Wellesley. So going back to the idea the army wasn't posh. So we think of him now as the Duke of Wellington. He only became the Duke of Wellington at the end of the Peninsular Campaign. He was Arthur Wellesley, the second son of, no, not the second, the third son of a minor Irish peer whose own mother said of him, Arthur is so stupid he's only fit for powder. He did, however, so there are many strange parallels between Wellesley and Napoleon. They both came from not particularly grand backgrounds. So I talked about how British officers had no training. Arthur Wellesley was the exception because his mother sent him to a French military academy rather than to a British public school. Don't think that this was because she was incredibly foresighted. It was because it was cheaper. So he actually did have some military training. But he was able to rise through the ranks by jumping regiments, buying commissions, and he was a lieutenant colonel by the time he was 25. He then went to India, where he was given command of his first army by the viceroy, who just happened to be his elder brother. Now, I often use Wellesley as an example when I'm talking about knowledge management with students, because he's an example of how even the worst system can have beneficial consequences. So one question that one might reasonably ask is, how was a British army possibly able to fight the French? A French army where promotion was entirely on merit, where you had marshals of France who had started out as private soldiers. Well, Wellesley's the example of how through a corrupt system, he was a lieutenant colonel at 25. He was a brigadier general before he was 30. And he just happened to be Britain's greatest military genius and was thus ready, willing, and able to command armies in the peninsula, where in a fairer system he would still be a major at best. And thus he became this massive impediment to getting rid of purchase for the next 50 years or more in the British Army, because whenever people would say purchase is a disaster, it leads to incompetent officers, people could point to Wellesley himself. Dragging myself back to the novels, let's talk about Colonel Fitzwilliam in Pride and Prejudice. I would suggest, well, I always think that Colonel Fitzwilliam is fairly obviously, in terms of his career, based on Wellesley and those like him. So again, one should not see Colonel Fitzwilliam as a grizzled military veteran. He is probably essentially Wellesley without the military genius. He could be no more than 30 and a lieutenant colonel. Another piece of trivia: whenever someone is called colonel in any of Jane Austen's novels, they are not a colonel, they are a lieutenant colonel. They were always called colonel because a full colonel at this stage, well, in exactly the same way as the Queen and Princess Anne and others still have the honorary title of colonel of a regiment. Anyone who is a full colonel, that it was essentially a figurehead title. Because the army although we talk about regiments, they were actually organised around battalions. And the commanders of battalions were lieutenant colonels. So lieutenant colonels were soldiers, full colonels were not. And so army officers went from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general without ever being full colonels. So I think Colonel Fitzwilliam will have purchased his way up to a lieutenant colonelcy in a home battalion, so that he has all the social advantages. He gets to stay at home, but I'm assuming he doesn't have the military ambition, and he doesn't want to go off and die of a horrible disease. Something else to be said about purchase. So it was an official system. There was an official price for any given rank. However, didn't you know there was going to be a however? There were significant unofficial premiums if you wanted to go into a more prestigious regiment. You would probably have to pay 4 or 5 times the official amount. There was a premium the higher. So the entire British Army has not just rankings amongst individual, but all the different regiments in the British Army have an order of precedence. Today, the top of the precedence is the Royal Horse Artillery, but in this period it was the Household Cavalry. Anyway. And you had to pay a massive premium if you wanted to go get into one of them. But there were also other premiums. So there was a premium on getting a commission in a home battalion rather than one that was about to go on foreign service. So Darcy, in buying Wickham a commission in what is a home battalion, is paying more for that. Harriet's going to be cross with me, but I will also suggest that him buying him an ensigncy suggests that Jane Austen doesn't know as much about the army as she would have known about the navy, because Wickham is absurdly too old to be an ensign. If one were charitable, one would say that they were desperate to get him a commission anywhere in a home battalion that was a long way away from the rest of the family, and therefore they parked him in an ensigncy there, and Darcy no doubt probably had to promise that he would buy him a lieutenancy when one became vacant. The corollary was that less prestigious regiments, you would not be able to sell the commission, or you would have to sell it at a massive discount. The New South Wales Regiment, for example, you literally could not give a commission away. And by the way, in that order of precedence, the New South Wales Regiment was at the bottom. It was even below the West Indies Regiment, where they routinely had casualties from disease of over 40%. Okay, so let me talk about the British Army in India. So I will start by pointing out that as well as the East India Company's troops, who were Indians, British regiments also served in India and in the East Indies. I should also say that at this period, the term Indies is used quite loosely. One should not assume that because it says that Colonel Brandon served in the Indies, that automatically means that he served in what we might think of as the East Indies, on the Malay Peninsula, Borneo, Singapore. Though it is true that during this period, the British are grabbing up as many Dutch colonies as they can before the French do. Um, it also included so service in India and the Indies were seen as essentially the same regiments, the same battalions served in both. Where there was an expedition into the East Indies, it was by troops stationed in India. So again, we need to recognise that service in India and in the Indies at the beginning of the 19th century was viewed vastly differently than it was from the middle of the century at the height of the Raj. It was not a popular posting, mostly because of the very high risk of dying, overwhelmingly from disease. Although this is also the period where the British are greatly expanding the amount of territory that they control through conquest in India. In 1800, they control probably less than a third of the subcontinent, although they are already recognised as the principal military power, but they are expanding rapidly. During this period, you have the Maratha War, the Sindh War. They are increasing their territory. So Arthur Wellesley Wellington, as he was to become, builds his military reputation fighting in India with these kind of combined forces. Another piece of Wellington trivia: Wellington never commanded an army in which British troops were the majority throughout his entire career. So in India, the majority of his troops were East India Company, Indian troops, and the troops of Allied rulers. In the peninsula, the majority of his troops were Portuguese or Spanish, and at Waterloo, the majority of his troops were Dutch, German, Hanoverian. Again, because they were the smallest army. So I would think that it is more than... So this brings me to Colonel Brandon. How do I know that Colonel Brandon was a British regular army officer rather than an East India Company officer? It's very simple, because at when he's describing where he is before he goes, before he goes to the Indies, he describes being with his battalion in England. No East India troops were ever stationed in Britain. So that's how I know that he must have been a British army officer. However, it's here that purchase may well have worked to Brandon's advantage, because that means he was holding his rank in a home battalion. So a home battalion is, sorry, I realise that I've used this term 30 or 40 times now and never exactly explained what it was. So a home battalion is one that's based in the British Isles. Traditionally, the idea behind home battalions was that they were there to train troops who would then be sent off to the service battalions overseas. As the war went on, as the demand for troops became greater, as I talked about, even many of these home battalions, at least of infantry regiments, ended up getting sent to the peninsula or to Canada during the War of 1812, and their roles at home replaced by the militia. So being willing to leave a home battalion and go to one on Indian service, when he arranged that transfer, without doubt he would have made money on that. And he quite possibly made enough money that he would have been able to purchase a promotion with that. So he might have left Britain as a lieutenant and arrived as a captain, or left as a captain and become a major. And then having been a major, he only needs for his lieutenant colonel to pop his clogs, and he's a colonel. So again, this feeds back into to Marianne describing him as old and it being pointed out that he's not old at all. It's not surprising. It's not at all surprising that someone who'd been on Indian service could be a lieutenant colonel at his age. But the culture of service in the Indies at this period was quite different from what it was later. This is well before the age of the Memsahib. It is well before the age of the fishing fleets. And as a consequence, officers on Eastern service did develop a rather loose reputation, particularly amongst the more straight-laced amongst the gentry class. They were known for a variety of dubious practices, including dressing in native dress, which seems to me, if you're going to be stationed somewhere where it's 40 degrees, sounds very sensible, but nonetheless that was proved. They were known for forming relationships with local women. Now at this stage, marriages between British officers and Indian women were not unknown, whereas later in the Raj that was deeply non-respectable. Colonel Skinner that I mentioned was an example of that. So they did have this reputation for immoral practices. They were also notorious for duelling. So duelling was banned in all the British services, but it was known that Indian officers were notorious for duelling. So I do think that it's quite interesting that there are clear echoes of both those prejudices in Sense and Sensibility, where he is accused of having an illegitimate daughter, and he fights the only duel in Jane Austen. Harriet is pointing out that I've talked for far too long, which is quite right, but I did want to finish by going back to where I started, and that is something that, if we think about it, is, from our perspective, is really very odd from the perspective of the 20th century. And that is how removed the gentry class felt from the conflict which had been being waged throughout their lifetime. That members of the gentry class, unless they were seeking as a third best choice to develop a career in the military, seem to have felt very little sense of duty to serve their country. So, just to finish, I'd like you all to think about what Pride and Prejudice would look like if it was set in 1914 rather than 1814. Here we have Darcy and Bingley, two fit, healthy young gentlemen with no apparent employment, who have absolutely no interest whatsoever in serving their country. In that 1914 context, they'd be social pariahs. And I have no doubt that Mary Bennet would be the first to hand them the white feather. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
My goodness, haven't we learned a lot about all those words we take for granted, like militia and all these other things? It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Michael.
You're very welcome.
Does anyone have questions they would like to ask?
So the question was, what were the militia raised to protect the country from? they were raised in the period when Napoleon Bonaparte was actively preparing to invade Britain. Just as Hitler was building an invasion fleet during the Second World War in 1940, in 1800 Napoleon Bonaparte was developing an invasion fleet. However, in order to invade, they needed, as in the Second World War, the challenge for the Germans was having air superiority, which they were never able to achieve. Napoleon was never able to achieve control of the English Channel. So the bringing together of the French and Spanish fleets before Trafalgar was entirely about the idea that they would, at least for a brief period, be able to maintain control of the channel long enough for the invasion fleet to go across. So that's what they were raised for. They never had to do it, and after Trafalgar, there was never that prospect. And just as and with another parallel between Napoleon and Herr Schicklgruber, as Churchill liked to describe him, Napoleon ended up giving up on invading Britain and turned his interests towards the east with similarly unfortunate consequences.
Any other questions?
The question was, would there be any circumstances in which Darcy would be forced to fight? In the period of the novels, no. If you were a member of the gentry class, I suppose in theory your name could have come up for service in the militia, but you could pay the fine or get a substitute. But even then, there was no way that you could be compelled to fight in the army overseas. The Navy's slightly different story. We'll leave that for another time. But no, this is one of the reasons that the British Army is so small throughout this period. This is another parallel that's only obvious to me now as I'm saying it. The British Army in the Napoleonic Wars was like the AIF in the First World War. They were the only army entirely composed of volunteers. The difference being that while Australians volunteered out of patriotism, they volunteered because it was better than starving to death.
And I know that press ganging took place for people in the Navy, but
yes.
Did it ever happen for the Army?
Not legally.
Oh, okay.
No. So it was entirely legal if you were someone who had known the sea, which was a nicely ambiguous way of putting it, then you could be pressed into the Navy. So you had to volunteer for the army. Now, they had recruiting sergeants who went round. There's the play by the 18th century play by Sheridan. Okay. So it's about. So they developed various methods of. So it was quite common to go to county fairs, get young men roaring drunk, slip them the king's shilling, and then when they came to say, "Tough luck, old son, you've volunteered," but there was no impressment.
Or merit?
So the question was about promotion outside of purchase and whether it was seniority or merit. The official system was entirely on seniority. However, very rarely for acts of extreme courage, one could receive a battlefield promotion. So, for example, if you led what was called a forlorn hope. In the peninsula, as you may be aware, he naively says, there were quite a lot of sieges. When there would be a break in the wall, they would call for volunteers to be the first through the breach, which was suicidally dangerous. So if you were an officer, you were automatically guaranteed a promotion if you survived, and if you were an enlisted man, you were guaranteed being made up to sergeant if you survived. Similarly, for certain extreme acts of gallantry, one could be promoted on merit, but the system worked entirely on seniority. So if a captain died, then whoever is the lieutenant with the most seniority in the battalion gets that captaincy regardless of their competence or otherwise.
Can I suggest that maybe if you have other questions, you come and chat to Michael during afternoon tea. Could I ask Judy now to come and say thank you on behalf of all of us?
Michael, thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. You stepped in at a late stage to be our speaker today. It was highly informative. It was beautifully illustrated. And I have to say there's some personal connections for me. Wellington's a great hero of mine as well. Also, my 4 times great-grandfather was the quartermaster sergeant of the 36th Regiment of Foot in Wellington's army. And he was from Dearness, Orkney, which I noticed your Orkney connection as well. That was not a prestigious regiment, I have to say. Yes. And I'm also the mother of a serving infantry officer in the Australian Army, so lots of connections. On behalf of Jazza, thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
I would also just like to add a thanks to Harriet. Sometimes living with a Jane Austen Society member can be a rather dangerous business. They get roped in to do things, as was the case with Michael. But gosh, that was a really fascinating talk. And I look forward to reading it all again in Sensibilities. And of course, those who were not lucky enough to be here today can get to watch it. So thanks to Cheryl for the filming that she's been doing at the meeting during COVID times. And thank you everyone for braving the cold, coming out today. We now have tea and coffee to warm us up a bit, and I think we've had a very special afternoon indeed. So thanks everyone.